Welcome to GCSE Masterclass. Today we're going to be having a little look at the social and historical context of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. And this means that we're looking at the things that were happening in the country at the time and in the world at the time that influenced Dickens' writing and which helped him to decide the messages that he wanted to give through his novel. Let's have a little look at Charles Dickens' life to understand how his experiences shaped his writing. Now, Charles Dickens started off really rather wealthy, but his father, John Dickens, fell into debt and he was imprisoned in Marshalsea Prison. Now, this was a very sad time for Charles Dickens, who was aged 12, because all of his 7 brothers and sisters were moved to prison with his father because his mother decided that that would be the best way of protecting them. He, however, as the oldest, aged 12, lived alone as a child labourer, and he worked in a factory that made bottles for black boot polish, and it was called a blacking factory. This gave Charles Dickens a real insight and experience into how the life was for working class people and children, and he was shocked and he felt this was morally wrong, and his writing conveys this message that he wants change and he wants the poor to be treated better. Luckily for Charles Dickens, his father inherited some money a few years later, and Charles Dickens was sent to private school again for 2 years. He soon finished school and he became a law clerk and then a journalist. But the family, at the point that the father inherits money, are not rich enough to go back to their old type of life, and they moved to a poor area of London, to Camden, which now is really rather a wealthy place, but at that point was a poor area of London. And he sees how the poor live in overcrowded conditions, and the rich have a totally different life and don't understand the life of the working class. Now, Dickens' novels have got these social messages, and he wants to reform society. He wants, through his writing, to bring about change to the way that poor people live and to bring more equality. Here's a picture of Charles Dickens. In 1843, when the novel A Christmas Carol was published, Dickens had read a report, and it was about the abuse of child labourers in factories. And he said, I quote, "This novel will strike a sledgehammer blow on behalf of the poor man's child." And what he's saying metaphorically is he wants to smash apart the oppression and the bad treatment of poor people's children through his writing. So that's one of his purposes, and his message is that we're treating the poor wrong, that the rich are treating the poor wrong. Now, at this time that the novel was written and set in 1843, the Industrial Revolution was really in swing. It started around 1780, the Industrial Revolution, and it was when factories started to use steam engines to power machines, and that meant that factories could have lots of machines working and they could produce things much quicker. Now, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, they needed people to work these machines, and so many people moved from the countryside where they'd been farmers or worked on farms to the factory to work in cities. A lot of businessmen became very, very rich. Let's have a look at these factories here. Look at all these people squashed up together working, these women on the sewing machines, and these children, they can't be any older than sort of 6 or 7, I would say. And so there's this exploitation going on where the rich factory owners and businessmen are using the labour of poor people to become rich. Lots of jobs were created. So in one sense it was positive, but really the jobs were very, very harsh. Factory workers often lived in extreme poverty. So they'd come from the countryside where they had lots of space, and they came over to the city, and it was a very hard life. Let's have a little look at what it was like living in the cities. Here's a picture here of London, and you can see all these people squashed up together. Millions of people moved from the countryside to the cities. Let's have a look at some statistics. Between 1800 and 1900, the population of London grew from 1 million to 6 million. So in 100 years, there were 6 times as many people living in London. Clearly, they were living in houses that weren't built for that many people. There was huge overcrowding. There was also the very sad state of homelessness. In 1838, shortly before the novel was published, there were at least 30,000 homeless street children in London. This is children living on the street, young children with or without parents. It's a desperate state. Many people lived in slums, and we can see inside a house in London here, and you can see people living with sort of filthy conditions. Look at their unwashed clothes. There's lots of people in the room, lots of beds all squashed up. They didn't have sewers or drainage, so there was nowhere to put your sort of toilet products or your dirty water. Many families shared one tap and toilet. And when we say many, we're talking 30, 40, 50 families sharing one tap and one toilet. Clearly this overcrowding led to hunger, disease and crime. And it was a really, really sad time for people living in these overcrowded cities. Children suffered the most. They were exploited by factory workers, often starting work at age 4, 5 or 6. They were paid badly and they were abused by the factory workers. Beaten, we don't know what else, probably worse. There was a man called Thomas Malthus, a wealthy economist. Here's a little picture of him. Now he wrote in 1798 that poverty was inevitable. That means you can't avoid it. It's a natural part of humanity. And he said that because poverty was inevitable, he thought you shouldn't do anything to help it. The reasons he gave for thinking it was inevitable was that he said that population, or the amount of people, would always grow faster than food supply, saying there's always going to be more people and not enough food. He claimed it was inevitable that poor would die, and that this was necessary and needed to reduce overpopulation. So he didn't think the government should do anything to help the poor. He said, let them die, essentially. And we see, don't we, that Scrooge says things like this. He says, let them die and decrease the surplus population. So we see that Dickens has created Scrooge to echo the words of Malthus and to mock them and prove it's cruel and wrong. Dickens, the writer, strongly claimed that there was enough food for all. And you can see in the novel, in chapter 3, there are 3 or 4 pages dedicated to descriptions of food. The ghost of Christmas present arrives and he is surrounded by food. In the writing, Dickens is saying, look, there is enough food, it's just that we're not sharing it. Dickens really believed that the problem wasn't the lack of food and too many people. He thought it was the greed of the rich, taking more than their fair share. At the time that the novel was set, there was this awful law called the Poor Law. And what this was done, it was a way of reducing costs to the government and to the rich taxpayers. What it did is it made taxpayers pay less, and it meant that there was less money or financial help available to the poor. So there was nothing to help them. If they were in dire straits, they couldn't feed their family. There was one thing available to them, though, or possibly two, but you wouldn't want either. I'll tell you what that was. Now, the logic was that financial help, helping the poor with money, encouraged laziness and made them lazy. So the Poor Law said, well, don't help them. You're going to make them lazy if you give them money. The only option for poor people was the workhouse. This was what they called support for the unemployed. It was essentially forced labour for families, where they would sleep in this workhouse, they would do labour for very little money, and they'd be given very poor quality food. Look here, we've got children working long hours separated from their parents in the workhouses. These workhouses were deliberately harsh, and it was to discourage people from poverty and unemployment. And just take a minute and think of the logic of that. Does anybody choose to be poor and not have a job, or are you just forced into that? It just seems like you're punishing people for being poor. Now, Malthus was influential in this change and this law, the Poor Law. Let's have a little look at some conditions in the workhouses. Look at these men eating their food, all squashed up. Horribly poor food. They're separated from the women and the children. The families were separated. Look here, the women sewing long hours all day. And here the children again, separated from their parents. They would have eaten separately, probably slept separately, worked separately, desperate for children. Lastly, let's have a little look at Victorian society and Christianity and Christmas. Now, Dickens is using the novel to give his idea of what a good Christian should be, and he disagrees with a lot of the popular view. At this time in history, in the 1840s, Christianity was very influential on the upper and middle classes particularly. They had a very strict moral code, at least on the surface, superficially. It was important for them to attend church, not to drink alcohol, and to be sexually restrained, just to only sleep with your husband and wife, and they wanted to be seen doing this. It was all about being seen to be a good Christian. Now, Dickens isn't really into this. He feels that good deeds are more important to being a Christian. And you see, don't you, that at the end, Scrooge has changed, and he carries out these good deeds, buying the prize turkey for the Cratchits, giving a raise to Bob Cratchit, and giving many back payments to the charity men who he feels he should have helped for a long time. So we can see that Dickens thinks it's your important thing about being a Christian is your behaviour rather than how you appear to be. There were a group at the time called the Sabbatarians, and they felt that you had to go to church regularly and that you had to rest on Sunday. They wanted to force every shop and restaurant and baker's shop to close on Sunday. Now Dickens doesn't agree with this because Sunday was the only day that most factory workers had off, and it was the one day of the week that they got a hot meal, and they'd get this by taking their food to the bakers. And Dickens felt that if you forced the bakers to close on Sunday, you were punishing poor people. If you have a little look when we've got the Ghost of Christmas Present, Scrooge says to the ghost, "You seek to close these places on the seventh day." And the ghost disagrees, saying that he doesn't want to close the places. So we can see that Dickens is using the Ghost of Christmas Present to say that Sabbatarianism is wrong. Lastly, we see at this time when the novel was written, and later on, Christmas becomes the main celebration. 50 years before the novel was written, nobody really celebrated Christmas, but it becomes hugely popular with Christmas trees, Christmas cards, and a sense of Christmas spirit. The idea that you should be generous and giving and sociable at Christmas time. So, that's the end of our presentation. I really hope you've enjoyed it and it helps you understand the context and the messages of Dickens.